Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi, sad music YouTuber. And why am I sad? Because I just learned how to play Earth Mover on acoustic guitar, and the vibes of that song are so pervasive, they're so saturated, they got such a way of getting into your system that it just makes you sad. But today is not a day to be sad because we're covering more of the Shoegaze chart. I'm very excited to say. Got another 10 albums for you guys, and I couldn't be more excited. So what's the vibe for today? What's the move with these albums? I'll tell you, it goes into a lot more of a space rock direction. We're gonna carve into some space rock territory, and then we go along the top side of the chart, kind of curving down, going through some sad stuff, some slowish stuff, some pretty noisy stuff at that. And we're reaching some unique territory today, and we're actually going to cover some stuff that is kind of referenced on the Black Gaze chart this episode and the next episode. But I will say that the quality of these 10 releases are not as consistent as the past 10 releases, a bit unfortunately. But I'm not that upset. Not every genre can be perfect. But I do have some gripes about the placement of some of these, but we'll just get into these right now. So first, we have a sort of 2-album collection here, and this is where we reach spacier vibes. So, we're getting into sort of semi-space rock territory, which is good and bad for me. Space rock and heavy psych are 2 genres for me that I absolutely love, but I haven't dug as deep into them as I would like to, so this was relatively helpful, I guess. But we start off with Highspires' Your Everything, kind of a sleeper hit, not an album I see posted really ever. So I was really wondering what such a niche album was doing here, and if it would actually be as appealing as it should be, if it's so cult. And I will say that there's some cool novelty about this album. For being a band that's not from England, there's a lot of trip hop elements. It's like a trip hop shoegaze blend, but the trip hop is only there on so many tracks, so it's not really as common as you'd think. And the tones of all these instruments is very ambient leaning, spacey, if you will. As far as the Spotify mix of this goes, I was a little bit underwhelmed. The tones are not amazing of any of these instruments, but that being said, I think if you were to see these people live or on a vinyl recording, then you would be very pleasantly pleased with how it sounds. But I can't really give it a good rating just because of what I think it would sound like, because this isn't a band that seems to have the highest fidelity equipment. But if you're so tone sensitive in a genre such as shoegaze, I feel like that's kind of the only genre to really focus in on that stuff. The songs Skies You Climb and Shattered are both fantastic. The song Subpar Life in the trip hop department actually has a whole lot of strength, but I think overall this album is just good. Not that that's really much of an issue, but I think it's good. And next we have a band I've talked about before in a totally different chart and a totally different time. This is the Verve with Storm in Heaven. Now, the Verve is a Britpop band that really kind of went away from the shoegaze style. And knowing how Britpop is very much shoegaze adjacent, and knowing that the Verve kind of did sort of like touches of Spiritualized in their later work, you'd kind of think that this would be like a very lush, very mellow sort of album here with very British vocals, stuff kind of like Ride, perchance. But actually, no, you actually get quite a jammy record here. There's a whole ton of spacey feedback that just swamps the whole mix. There are hints at the future of this band where they would delve into the Britpop sound with the poppy choruses and the really well-developed hooks. And this whole thing is saturated in this really cool, smooth energy. It feels like rock and roll, it feels cool to listen to. It's got a vibe to it that doesn't alienate the listener or feel too bizarre or weird or too in its own head. The tone on the song The Sun, the Sea in particular is probably one of my favorite tones on the whole album. And the Verve is a band that really doesn't miss, and I really should check out again their most popular album because I like everything else they've had so far. And I've heard all their output is actually really good up until their final album, but maybe I'll check it out again. Maybe there was something in it that I didn't see. But I really think this album is great, to be honest. And then this goes into more spacey with Spiritualized's album, Laser Guided Melodies. Now, I don't think I've talked about this album that much on this channel, and nor have I talked about Spiritualized that much. But when it comes to Low and Spiritualized and any of those other sort of experimental rock bands that sort of came out in the 90s that have definitive genres, which these are definitely probably the 2 best examples. Spiritualized is my baby. I love pretty much everything they've done. I love Amazing Grace. I love Laser Guided Melodies. Everything off of Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space is fantastic. Their latest album was really solid too. But this album right here might honestly be my favorite of theirs. And I highly recommend you guys check out their live album, Effed Up Inside. It came out after this one. It's got a whole bunch of Spaceman 3 material after that. In terms of albums that are on this chart so far, you know, you got your Loveless, you got your Chiron Ursa. Those are probably the two most iconic albums I've covered before today. Up with those in terms of quality is Laser Guided Melodies. This thing is amazing, and it takes those sort of traditional rock and roll ideas of the 2-chord melodies and drills them into the ground with some of the most lush instrumentation, some of the most gripping stuff ever. It really stretches out a song to its breaking point in terms of how much attention it can grab you, but it all feels perfect. And the thicker instrumentation of like the saxophone and the horn sections really give it a huge boost. It actually feels kind of like the Verve, you know, like that subtle rock and roll energy is so present here. This album doesn't feel quirky at all, despite the textures being super bizarre. I could go on and on about this thing, but one thing I'll be semi-quoting people from Mew when describing it. There was a thread one time when people said, what is the best album to be on opioids to? And the answer was Laser Guided Melodies. And everyone agreed for once, which on Mew, people don't agree on anything. So that just kind of goes to show the sheer gravity of how freaking good this thing is. So yeah, it's great. It's amazing. Maybe my favorite album of here so far. And then we get even spacier. And I remember seeing this chart because I had listened to Laser Guided Melodies plenty of times before, and I saw that spacier goes into a Flying Saucer Attack self-titled album. And I was thinking to myself, what on earth could be spacier than that? And this Flying Saucer Attack album is kind of an interesting bag here because it's one of those albums that you must listen to at a very high volume. I'm talking about you have to be in your car, have to have a good stereo system. Listening to them on Spotify, let me tell you, the mix on Spotify is awful. And I stopped probably a song or two in just to switch to Bandcamp because for some reason Google Chrome on my computer is like louder than Spotify. This is such a texturally sensitive album that if it doesn't absolutely like rip your face apart with how loud it is, you're not getting half the experience here. But I've been talking about the sort of rock energy that has been happening on the Verve and Spiritualized. We depart from that entirely here for a very quirked up album. And you get this gorgeous lo-fi crunchy shoegaze sound. And it honestly sounds potentially like I feel like there's a chance this album could have been made by accident with how insanely cool it is, because it sounds like just the recording quality is just pitted in the specific way that makes it sound like this. But I would not be surprised also if all these various textures were thought of very methodically. Also, like you might think that like YouTube typically has louder ports than like Spotify. For some reason, the version I found and all the versions I found were still quiet. I was really shocked at that. I didn't understand that at all, but not really much of a point in using it on YouTube anyway. The audio quality is not great. The walls of abrasive crunch are super cool, and as much as these shoegaze tracks are really interesting, and for some reason everyone on Bandcamp seems to think that those are the highlights, the last several tracks are all ambient leaning, and they're all like guitar ambient. And when it means spacey, these are the spacey ones to look after, and they sound just awesome. I love how the song Wish just turns into this brick wall of sound. It's genuinely one of the most satisfying parts of the album. The Season Is Ours is probably my favorite track on here, but really any of the ambient leaning ones that come towards the tail end are all great. I give this album a great, but this is one of those albums I feel that you should take a risk and purchase and listen to a physical copy before really bothering to stream it anywhere, because streaming it really just does it a disservice. And of course, you know, support artists anyways. You know, there's a very talented guy, very talented band, very intelligent people, you know, just support them. So that was weird, but the chart says we got to go spacier, and it's literally just spacier. And this is quite a weird album because it's very misleading. Also, it's one of those albums that I've talked about where it reaches sort of like the final conclusion of a genre. At this point, it's stretching away from shoegaze, and I think the creator of this chart knows that. And we're going to get to that with plenty of other stuff here. You know, a lot of this stuff really just delves into other genres. There's a point that I'll probably reach on the slow dive section where it just reaches like alt rock. But this one's a little bit different because now you just reach straight ambient territory. This is Symphony of the Planets 1, NASA Voyager recordings. So you'd think, wow, cool. You get field recordings of space, you know, that's interesting. not really all that musical, kind of musique concrète at best. But this thing, I don't know if you know much about space. Gonna get a little sciencey for a moment. Space doesn't sound like much. It sounds like very little at all. So what could this album be? It's lying to you. It's not actually entirely space recordings. It's really like a collaged effort here of all these different ambient textures and stuff. And I think very few of them are recorded from actual space. And this is full of very, very monotonous, legato, light synthesizer work. And calling it a drone album, you would not be wrong. Honestly, this thing drones for days, and I think it literally holds the same sliding synthesizer tones for the entire 31-minute duration. And this makes me wonder if bands like Dark Space could use textures like this to beef it up, but I think it's really, to me, it sounds kind of unfinished. It does not sound like something that is a very gratifying listen all the way through. It wasn't an unenjoyable experience. I'm giving this an okay, but in my opinion, you could use this for background ambient, or you could use this for a bass line of something else. I think it needs something on top of it. It's really not my type of ambient, but I'd be lying if I said it was really flawed in a way other than what I described. So that's that little section of the chart covered right there. So we're going back to Loveless. This is even past the two Little Lilies and LSD in the Search for God albums, because we're going in a different direction. This is noisier. And you think, Loveless is already pretty noisy. How do you get much noisier than that? Well, I could give you a few examples of noisier stuff, but right now we're going to be talking about something that I personally would claim is about as noisy, but some sections get noisier. So it's really like a percentile difference of noisiness. Not that this is really relevant. I'm sure you guys are probably wondering, if anything, if the album's good or not. But this is Ecstasy of St. Teresa with Susurrate, if that's how you pronounce it. To be honest, I don't really know. And this album's pretty difficult to find. It's not really on a lot of streaming services. It's on YouTube as far as I could tell. But the appeal of this album is certainly the noisiness for it. The bass tone, in particular, is monstrously huge. And the vocals are barely audible, but honestly, it's pretty cool how it's done like that. Also, we got the male and female vocal setup, a classic shoegaze thing. I don't know why every single band loves to do that so much. I don't have a problem with it. It's just, it feels like it's like you really show who you're influenced by when you do the male and female vocal setup. It's like, I don't know how many bands would think of that if My Bloody Valentine didn't do it, even though it's like such an easy thing to think of. But to be honest, I couldn't think of many albums outside of shoegaze that I listen to that have a male and a female vocalist that have such distinctive parts. But I should mention that Susurrate has two highly regarded EPs other than this album. And other than this album, they have a bunch of other albums that aren't shoegaze, really. They sort of dive into other genres. In my opinion, these tracks are way better when their tones are borderline ambient and they're played in this really drawn-out way that really makes it feel more lush. There are songs like Sweet Abyss that feel like archetypal modern shoegaze, that it feels like it kind of paves the way for tracks like that. And it feels like tracks like this kind of pave the way for the modern shape of shoegaze. Bands like Whir might not exist without Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Now, I don't know how much noisier this is than Loveless, but it is certainly more ambient feeling, and I don't really have an issue with that. It actually feels more ambient than even MBV, and the song Absinthe sounds amazing. That is probably my favorite track on here. But I'm feeling a grade on this thing. It's basically like an alternative version of My Bloody Valentine. It's pretty similar, but you're going to get that for quite a while on this chart. And then we go into a noisier direction. This is Astrobrite with Crush. So this is noisier and dreamier, and of course the MBV comparisons are obvious, but I think this actually sounds floatier. When you reach niche microgenres like noise pop oriented shoegaze, you really can't slack on the differences, because sometimes you have to look really, really small and detail oriented to find much differences at all. Now, I'd say this album is a bit more post-punk influences, but the bass tone itself is very dreamy. It's really hypnotic, actually, kind of maybe dipping into krautrock for a moment or two. And the guitar is borderline stagnant on a few of these songs. Like, the sound just drapes over you like a blanket, and it just sticks there. And I'd say it borderlines noise rock at plenty of points, a lot of abrasion in these tones. And I noticed something rather weird about this album, and it's a pretty immersive album, so I really had to zone out for a moment. But these songs can be loud as hell, and just because they have no drums, they still feel like a ballad. And it just, the chords and the songwriting itself makes it feel like a ballad, and I thought that was just hilarious because like it's just monumentally crushing. Like it feels like you got a building on top of you, but it's so sweet at the same time. The song Hopefully is amazingly dreamy, but I do have a pretty major complaint about this album. There are only like a few songs with drums, and I'm pretty sure they're a real drum kit. I know this thing is like super crushed up production, so maybe it's a little difficult to tell. The pacing of this album is greatly weakened by the amount of like ballads and like more chill tracks. And they don't all need to be here, honestly. So I give this album a good, but if you want to pick and choose your favorite tracks on this album, then you're going to get a pretty decent experience. And then we go into noisier, less traditional with Skywave with the album Synth Static. And this one is noisy and psychedelic. It's also super weird, and describing it at first felt really difficult. The drumming on these is incredibly primal, very repetitive, and the songs can be quick and energetic while having really filled out and huge amounts of noise. And I was trying to think of what makes this album so distinctive sounding, and the best thing I could come up with is it feels like it has a heavy dosage of new wave, but not as much of the quirkiness that new wave comes with. It basically is like if New Order was influenced by My Bloody Valentine, I guess I could say, but like less synthesizers at the same time. It's also a very melodramatic album, but at the same time, that vibe kind of fits the sound. And some of these tracks feel like much more straightforward new wave, though. So that's probably the best descriptor I could give for this album, is that it feels pretty new wave. And the thing is, this album was going super strong for probably the first 2/3, but then the whole last third of the album, honestly, it just kind of shows how the sound isn't as strong as it should be. It's not paced nearly as well as you would like it to be. It kind of just drones on and on and on. And at the end of it, the songs seem like they drag for forever. But I think if like 10 minutes of this album were shaved off, it would feel pretty tight and pretty perfect. But right now, I give it a good. And then we go into more sad with True Widow, with an album described here, High as the Highest Heavens. But the title is actually As High as the Highest Heavens and From the Center to the Circumference of the Earth. So what could this be? A really interesting combination of genres, but at the same time, not much better than the sum of its parts. Now, this could sort of invent a new genre here, or specific set of subgenres, because it kind of combines stoner rock, slowcore, and shoegaze. And when I mean slowcore, I mean the most repetitive songs ever. I'm talking about 8 minutes of the same 2 chords, and they're not even played much differently from each other. But the tone is distinctly heavy, and it feels super doomy. If you like stoner metal, you'll probably at least like this album. And it is a slow crawl, very different from what I'd normally like to listen to. And it's weird kind of getting sunk into such a different sense of pacing. And I haven't listened to an enormous amount of slowcore, but this does feel pretty different. It's also really thick and bassy. If you sink into the sound, it's cool, but it is kind of a weird album. It's certainly unique, but I give it a good, it's pretty interesting. I'd probably take this over the other goods I've listed so far. And then we get the distinction Blacker with Alcest and their full-length debut. Now, I've talked about this album before, and that was a long, long time ago. And in about a week or 2 or 3, perchance, I'm going to be talking about a different Alcest release. And this is Spiritual Instinct is their second album. And I'm going to say straight up, Spiritual Instinct is a better album than this one. And people don't really talk about it that much. It is a better album, but there are 2 different vibes entirely. Spiritual Instinct has a very distinct A and B side, where the A side is very straightforward post-metal black gaze, and then the B side has some ambient, some folk, and some other stuff, and it kind of divides into the different tracks. And it's a 6-track album as far as I could tell, so it's very well thought out like that. But this first album here, which its name I'm not gonna say because I don't speak French and I don't want to embarrass myself, certainly leans more into the dreamy sense of shoegaze, a lot less post-metal and more ambient. And of course, this is top 5 most essential black gaze records, and an essential one at that. And this is a dreamier and more somber album here. I'd say that their second album is a bit more sad. You got some really, really intelligent moments on this whole album here. You got the lead guitar on the title track, which sounds just phenomenal. I'd say the songs on this album are a bit less distinguishable than I would like them to be, but they're still so beautiful that you can't complain that much. This is very foresty, and it feels pretty folky at the same time. And there's a good amount of acoustic work that's thrown in on the B side of this album. In fact, the last song is pretty much just folk, it's just like slightly dreamier folk. But I'm going to be a little generous and give this album a great, you know? It's very satisfying listen all the way through, just gorgeous tones throughout. Nej's singing is beautiful, and this is an album that he actually did all the instruments on, so that's also pretty cool. But if you want to get into Black Gaze, you know, this is an essential Black Gaze record. And, you know, next time we talk about this chart some more, I'm going to be covering 3 different Black Gaze albums. But that's about it for the chart today. I hope you guys enjoyed this so far. Sorry the albums aren't as good, but you know, I didn't make the chart. I'm just critiquing it. But I do like the sort of weirdo picks right now. Only thing is, I don't know how it went. Going from Skywave into True Widow feels really bizarre to me. I don't really know why that point was made. You know, the noise factors were like totally different. But you know, at the same time, there are a lot of bangers on here so far. You know, like this for the Spiritualized album alone, it's kind of worth it. But that's about it for today. Hope you guys are enjoying the series so far. And if you're following me along in the Black Gaze chart as well, I hope you guys are ready for a lot better albums. Not really this week, but like the week later. But you got some good stuff coming, I promise. But I'm really into this chart so far. A lot of really interesting little genre collaborations going on here. My vocab is all over the place today. I apologize. But you know, I think you kind of get my point. But that's about it. Hope you guys are doing well out there. Hope you guys take the time to check out my social media in the link below. Definitely hit the subscribe button, you know, hit the bell icon, even though I upload like once a week. So if you remember that, you don't have to, but you know, it's something about the algorithm. So I would appreciate that. Comments, questions, or concerns, you know, go ahead and comment down below. I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts on this thing. Discord in the description, you know, join me there. You know, we're all talking about some good music, and I hope you guys are doing well out there. So have a good day. Bye.